Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Banana Data Podcast. This is episode, I lost count at this point. Maybe it's 7, maybe it's 8. I'm not really sure. My name is Corey Straussman, and I am a community manager here at Data IQ, and you're joining us for a very special episode today. We'll get to that in just a moment. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome to the Banana Data Podcast. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe to anywhere you listen to podcasts. Could be Spotify, could be Apple Podcasts, could be anything. So wherever you get your podcasts, please give us a subscribe. I'm joined by my guest, the wonderful CPM. And before I let CPM go on, I'm just going to say one thing. For our very loyal listeners, last time, if you recall, we said that CPM and I would figure out if we can record a podcast by ourselves. We lied. So we apologize for that. We have a very special guest, and it will all be worth it. CPM, what do you have to say?
Yeah, so really excited to be back here today. Last time we talked about the importance of storytelling with data and discussed how the emotional impact of a story can help inspire people to take action on the results of data. Data is just numbers, but how can a story create empathy and have a call to action for that audience to inspire them to do something? So today, it's also really great to see you all because we're going to be delving more into data visualization. And we're joined by Nathan Mannheimer, the Director of Data Science and Machine Learning at Tableau. Nathan, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, folks, really glad to be here. My name's Nathan, and like CPM said, I'm a product director here at Tableau. So I work on areas where data science and machine learning really intersect with kind of Tableau's core mission around helping people see and understand their data. So lots going on, very exciting space to be in. And it's an area where I think there's some very interesting and very useful applications for data visualization. So very happy to be here today to talk data viz.
So we're going to talk data visualization today, and I'm going to start with a pretty simple and pointed question. And one of you two feel free to jump in and be like, what are you talking about? So when it comes to visualization, they say that a picture says 1,000 words. How many of those words are accurate?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And this cuts into a sort of a number of different parts on data visualization. The first is the data itself. A very effective data visualization can be built on very inaccurate or sort of misinformed data. So a lot of thought has gone into how do we accurately convey information and how do we do that in a way that is going to be understood really quickly and easily. But if the raw material isn't solid, the data viz is going to be inherently misleading. But then sort of taking it up to the next level, how do we process information? Our visual system is the highest bandwidth conduit into our brain. It's one of our most effective senses as we navigate the world. And that's the kind of physiology that we build on when we're constructing good data visualizations. And so we know that it's a very effective tool for conveying information, but that still requires thoughtful design, which can turn a okay visualization into a great one. And it means focusing on what's the story in that visualization. Are we making sure that the story that we want to tell, the facts that we are interested in expressing, are those popping to the surface? Are those not being clouded out by other noise in the visualization? And so assuming the data are good, it's really a matter of making sure that the encodings or the channels that we're constructing in that visualization are mapped to the facts in the data that we think are most important to convey. And when those two are lined up, visualization can be a really, really powerful tool for conveying information.
Yeah, I think it was the University of Minnesota that said that the human brains process visuals 60,000 times faster than they do text. So that ingestion of information is quite rapid with a well-constructed visualization. But on that note of trying to highlight the specific insight that you want to communicate, how do you sort of go about that process? Because there's so much information that's within data, assuming that the data set has been mined accurately and has been constructed in a well designed way. How do you hone in on that insight and then sort of start telling that story with a visualization?
Yeah, this is still a very, in many cases, human-centered process when we're building a visualization or constructing a template for, maybe automated future visualizations that we might want to construct. Because most data sets have more than 1 or 2 or 3 fields in them. And so
Mhm.
it's really important to understand what are the key things for this particular visualization, and not trying to overload that. Because when we're constructing visualizations, unfortunately, we humans are only limited to at most sort of seeing in 3 spatial dimensions. And so,
Yeah.
and we've sort of seen that most effective visualizations are often 2-dimensional. And so that limits the number of tools in our tool belt that we have to transform information, raw data, into the visual world. We know that humans are very good at certain comparisons, for example, position, comparing whether points are close or far from each other, or whether bars have different lengths or heights. And so we can use position very effectively. That's why bar charts and scatter plots are almost ubiquitous. But then going beyond that, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. We have to be a little bit more thoughtful. There are some really fantastic visualizations. The Napoleon's March on Moscow, really famous data viz, that play with these encodings in really creative ways. But it requires that kind of thought on what are the key elements of the story, and then are we conveying those effectively? Are we mapping those into the visual world in a way that's making best use of the tools at hand? And then sometimes the story is more complex than a few variables. And then we have to think a little bit more, sometimes creatively. Are we going to create multiple visualizations that tell a combined story? Maybe even are we going to transform the data in ways that extract the most useful or salient information, and then go back to the basics and use those 2-dimensional encodings again?
Yeah, I think we've all seen some over encoding in images or in graphics where they use shape and color and transparency and size and the x-axis and the y-axis and maybe an animation. And it just gets so overwhelming with trying to see like 10 different dimensions in one image. And although all the information is there and accurate, the takeaway from that image is completely lost and sort of distracting to the crowd. So finding that right balance and honing in on exactly the 1 or 2 insights you want somebody to draw, I think is really incredibly important.
It's one of those things where when we're really successful, a visualization shouldn't require a lot of work to decode. It should almost be pre-attentive. You should be able to look at it and not have to go back and forth to the legend or to other sort of descriptions about the viz. It should tell its own story as independently as possible. That's the ideal. Of course, it's not always possible to do that. And sometimes there are specific domains where the information is just more complex and we have to be a little bit more thoughtful depending on the audience. But that's always the goal, is that a visualization should essentially stand on its own and really push its story into the minds of the audience.
Well, there's a quote that I saw recently where people hear statistics, but they feel stories. And with that quote, it kind of reminds me of this piece that we recently read from Forbes, which we'll post in the episode notes, of course. Humanizing AI, a case for cognitive design thinking and custom AI. It talks about a 5-step process and about that humanizes creation process. Before I go into that process, do you kind of want to go into on the product side about like how you go into developing a process to ensure that, you know, the data and the visualization are collaborative with each other so that it's creating an all around great user experience?
Yeah, I think this is something that's sometimes misunderstood in data science, and people think of, you know, data visualization maybe slotting into just 1 or 2 parts of the process. But at its core, data visualization is just a tool for conveying information, and understanding information is important at every step of the machine learning and data science process, whether that's understanding the current state of the world, helping us frame up a question or an inefficiency or a problem, helping characterize the magnitude or the impact of that problem, and then getting into pulling relevant data, understanding the completeness, the veracity of that data, and then getting into understanding the, you know, exploratory data analysis, kind of the classic, you know, what do the data tell us at a first glance? What are interesting patterns that may emerge from that? And then getting into the modeling process, understanding, is one model performing better than another? What metrics do we measure that question by? What features are driving a model to make a prediction one way or another at a global level, at a prediction level, or even at a sort of a subgroup level? Is there disparate impact on model predictions or error as we break the data down? All of those are really either information-seeking tasks, and visualization is a great tool for information seeking. And then when we put a model into production, it goes even further. We want to monitor and make sure that that model is performing well. We're looking at data often changing over time, looking at changing volumes. These are great applications for visualization. And then probably the very important piece that affects a wide range of model outcomes, not all, but understanding how do we take those predictions and, again, humanize that? How do we bring that into a business process or a working process that people can understand, especially people who maybe don't have a background in stats or ML, certainly might not ever call themselves a data scientist. How do we make predictions and uncertainty around those predictions graspable to those folks who just want to do their jobs, want to better understand their world? And that's a great application for visualization as well, because we're taking new streams of information, predictions, and we're bringing those and conveying those to people in the places where they're already kind of inhabiting and working. And so throughout that whole kind of end-to-end spectrum of data science and machine learning, visualization plays a really key role in really just helping us understand the kind of salient information at each step.
Yeah, it's like the data visualization is important at every step of the data analysis pipeline, but also can serve each of the archetypes who might interact with the technical side and also the non-technical side. So as you mentioned, like in the classic EDA sector, right? Maybe analysts will serve well by virtue of presenting that information in aggregation forms and things like that. Numbers won't only tell the story. Cross tabulations won't only tell the story, but actually seeing that percent change or whatever the case may be is impactful. For the modeling piece, it's the data scientists or the data engineers who can evaluate those models. And then also the business stakeholders reading from a dashboard once the model is in production to see the output. So it's not only helping each of those steps in the data analysis pipeline, but also the stakeholders who might interact with either the building or the ingestion of the information.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we can even abstract it further than just saying a dashboard necessarily, or and actually even I would say a crosstab is a form of data visualization where we're conveying usually aggregate numbers in a formatted way that's easier for people to understand. But dashboards are a really common tool, and that's great. There are many other ways to consume visualizations. There are embedded in applications, things that pop up where you're consuming information, maybe on your phone, on your smartwatch, really wherever you're interacting with computers, or sometimes even in a static printed out form, we can have visualizations that help convey information for each of those parts of the process.
So we're going to segue a little bit here to the idea of uncertainty. So we're going to go from why visualization is such a certain great tool to sort of the uncertainty around it. Bad segue on my part. But before we get into that, I just want to quickly mention that if you're enjoying some of the information thus far, we welcome you to subscribe to the Banana Data Podcast wherever you listen to the podcast. But now we're going to talk a little bit about uncertainty. CPM, do you want to introduce this topic?
Yeah, so the measurement of uncertainty in images I think is quite important to talk about, because I feel like you could present accurate information, but the way in which you present it could also be prone to telling a story or an ultimate insight that might be misleading. I think also I'd like to talk about the difference between statistical versus practical significance here, and how that ladders up to maybe telling an insight that's true, but might also not necessarily tell a whole truth. Yeah, sorry, I kind of rambled there a little bit.
I think I think that's a great point, and it's a point that's certainly key to data visualization, and I would say broadly key to data science as well, which is we should never sort of abandon our common sense and our need to understand the domain that we're working in, even if we have really great tools that are accessible and useful to us. There are some silly examples of this kind of thing, and I think those are funny. I sometimes don't like using those because it leads people to think, oh, that will never happen to me. Like, I would never make that kind of a mistake. So there are those spurious correlation charts that you can track over time, and it shows things like consumption of Swiss cheese and engineering doctorate awarded over time. And it's like, there's like a 0.94 correlation coefficient between the two over 10 years. That's statistically significant, obviously, barring some very, very interesting relationship that I'd certainly love to know about, isn't really practically significant, because we can infer that there's not really a causal relationship between those things. But It's a fun example. It sort of shows us, yeah, you can draw interesting statistical patterns from nothing, or from spurious correlations. But there are very real and very practical examples of that. I saw recently a visualization that somebody shared that was showing the relationships between mask wearing percentage in various states and COVID hospitalizations. And it was looking at I don't think it was just quite raw numbers. I think it was, hospitalizations per 100,000. And it was showing a pretty significant linear correlation between increased mask wearing percentage and increased hospitalization. This person was, whether facetiously or not, making the point that, oh, look, more masks means more hospitalization. But if you actually look at the data, the states that had higher numbers of hospitalizations were dense urban states like New Jersey, New York, whereas the states that had really low numbers were like Montana, Wyoming, really relatively sparsely populated states. So
yeah,
a great example.
That latent variable.
Exactly. A great example of where there's a statistically significant pattern. The visualization bears that out, but we need to think a little bit more deeply before we accept that uncritically. And I think in this case, there are pretty clear other confounding variables, as you said, that are probably impacting that outcome that are not shown in the visualization. There are, of course, other good examples where kind of the reverse is true. The kind of classic data set that I'm not sure if you've seen, but pretty common, like the Anscombe's quartet, where 4 data sets, that have identical statistical measures. So 2 columns, the means of both are the same, the standard deviations are the same, and the linear model that you might fit to those are exactly the same. But when you visualize them, they're completely different. And so an example of where visualization shows us things that statistics might not. And so it's I think, and it's not to say, they're just tools. Neither is better than the other in any way. It's just, and they're very highly related. But more that we should always think critically. We should always use all of the tools at our disposal to better understand a problem before we walk away with a conclusion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think thinking about these tools that are at our disposal, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that it's the way in which the tool is used could change the way it actually impacts our audience. So, for example, if I'm thinking of a very simplistic bar chart, that's just analyzing 2 different groups, 2 different bars up against one another. Look at the proportion between these 2 crowds of version A versus version B. There could be a 49 to 51% split. And if I have my y-axis set at 0, it doesn't look like there's much of a difference. But if I have my y-axis zoomed in to between 48 and 52, it's going to look like there's such a big difference between those 2 bars. The information that I'm presenting is technically accurate in both of those visualizations, but the way in which I'm using the tool is sort of manipulating the way in which I want my audience to ingest that information. So I think, as with everything, the tool can be used towards for good or for bad, with malicious intent sort of behind that. And in that case, there is a very small margin of difference between those 2 bars, but the way in which I'm showing it or choosing to show it to my audience could tell a totally different story.
Absolutely. And I think, as with anything, responsible use of the technology. I mean, sometimes there's a story that you want to convey. Sometimes a small difference can be significant. But it's almost actually very similar to like p-hacking with the visualization. You're hacking your visual controls to make something pop out, make a story seem significant. And I think that in many cases, certainly you see this in popular media quite a bit. People go in with a conclusion in mind and stories, visualizations to tell that story, and that in many cases can be very misleading. Absolutely.
Yeah.
A solution in search of a problem.
Yeah.
Speaking of tools, since you brought up, I wanted to kind of talk about Tableau really quick, because Tableau, Nathan, don't need to tell you this, has really transformed the way that businesses, people, specialists, common people, whatever, just run-of-the-mill people look at how data is presented and how business outcomes are presented. So when we're looking at data visualization, especially at the enterprise level, what is really the bottom line? We talked about how data viz can really help people who aren't used to seeing raw data be able to better visualize and understand it. It creates more of a human-centered approach. We talked about, from the data science standpoint, about how it helps impact and visualize EDA. But if you're using Tableau, say if you're a data scientist or you're someone who is a decision maker, how is a product like Tableau really sort of promoting sort of the better business outcomes so that you can show how your data is making an impact, how it's making a difference, how resources could be better used?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, the mission for Tableau is we help people see and understand their data. For the C part, Tableau didn't invent data visualization. It's techniques have been foundational in the space for really hundreds of years, if not longer. But what Tableau did that was really special was make those techniques accessible to a wider range of people who had questions about the world, who were interested in their business, interested in how data were moving around them, but previously hadn't really had a tool that worked for them. And that allowed them to explore on their own and not go to somebody else and ask a question and then wait for a response to come back. And that freeing up of that kind of creativity and curiosity is where we've seen really huge success in Tableau, because most people are curious. Most people want to know why things are the way they are, and they want to do things better, and they want to do things faster. And so in creating a set of tools, a set of experiences that allow people to kind of unbridle that creativity, we found something really special and really exciting in that. And so when we're asking, how does that help improve business outcomes? How does that help improve awareness? It allows the people who are familiar with the data, familiar with the domain, familiar with how the data are being created, to ask questions on their own and start to understand that data, really in most cases in real time. And as new questions come up, to be able to follow those down the path of exploration and insight. And so that was what Tableau did that was really special in bringing that to a wider range than had ever really had access to the power of data visualization before.
Yeah, I love this concept of creativity. Letting your mind run wild can often help with finding something that you weren't even looking for in the first place. I forget which companies do it. I think maybe Google and Facebook and a couple of the big name companies might have like hackathon days where they give a whole day or a couple of days and just an open-ended question and say, you know what, you can do whatever you want as long as you come back and make sure you present to the team. And that has been the start of a lot of different ideas or product features at different companies, because you allowed for that creativity to sort of, or allowed for the space to explore creatively the data that you have, or some of the insights that you really didn't have time or were nice to haves on the list of the to-do list. So yeah, I love incorporating that, maybe automating the things that are the day-to-day, and freeing up some of that time to pursue other endeavors.
Yeah, and I think the thing that as we've grown, it's not necessarily just running, letting your mind run wild. Well, that can be really fun, but that, exactly to your point, kind of bringing back to the group becomes really important, especially in an enterprise setting. We want to allow people to not just explore, but also do that in an environment where their kind of starting point has been vetted and cleaned up by people who maybe are really deep and expert in the systems and the data. And of course, then allow them to take what they've done and bring that back and share that with their colleagues, with their teammates and leadership, so that the organization is really being empowered by more and more people who can contribute to the conversation about what success looks like and how are we understanding that.
Nathan or CPM, do you guys have like a personal experience that you can talk about with how data visualization really sort of transformed for something for you? I mean, it could be a data set, it could be a piece of data, it could be, a more relative example. I'd love to hear like how data visualization has impacted you either in a specific way or in a broader way in your day-to-day work, in your professional life, in your personal interests.
So I know on one of our previous episodes, we talked about weeks of our life, which certainly helped me have a little bit more carpe diem. But I can also think of another fun one. I think it was from Kyrgyzstan. In a nutshell, this YouTube channel, they also have really great animation skills. It was just evolution. and looking at, all of different life forms and how they've connected from, sort of the very beginnings of the amoebas all the way to humans. And it was really impactful to kind of see how it splayed out over time. And also another one about the expansion of the universe from the Big Bang to now also really helps me feel like I'm a part of a greater whole, and I'm just a speck of dust on the timeline of history. So really sort of, grounded me a little bit and related back to that, I got to seize the day from the Weeks of Life discussion.
I think for me, one of the ones that I really remember, because it was a big sort of moment for me early on in my career. I had just been starting to learn some Python, and I was playing around with just writing some simple programs. And some of the people that I was working with at the time, we were exploring some, and I forget the exact problem, but it was like a probability problem about, I think it was drawing, I had combinations of drawing M&Ms out of a packet. And two people solved the problem analytically and came up with one solution. And because I was sort of testing out my Python, I did a simulation and sort of ran through it. And when I was looking at my sort of results, I did a really basic like matplotlib histogram of the outcome. And my sort of like most likely number for the probability was like an order of magnitude off of what they had gotten. And so we came back sitting around, and they were like, oh, you probably made a mistake somewhere. This is definitely the right answer. And then when we came back the next day and looked at it again, it turned out that I was actually right, and that I had solved the problem correctly with a relatively simple program, but just sort of visualizing the output and looking at that result and seeing it. That was really exciting and powerful to me, and the fact that I could unlock that kind of power. And I will say these guys were better at math than me, both of them. So it took some convincing and back and forth, but in the end, it was sort of really validating and vindicating to see that I was capable of solving a problem, like a real problem, that obviously was like a little bit of a challenge to figure out. And so that was a really formative experience for me, and something that both in the sort of statistical sort of resampling simulation, but also visualization and exploring results, that has really stuck with me through my career, because that was a big kind of first exciting kind of win for me in that space, and something that I really remember.
I think it's fair if I provide an example as well, since I would put you guys on the spot here. So it's not really an example as much as a recommendation. I'm someone who likes to follow current events, politics, international news a lot. And one of my favorite people to follow, who's a data visual artist at The Guardian, is Mona Chalabi. She is, I highly recommend that you check her out. She takes all the hot button issues that has data around it, and she visualizes it, and it's really like a work of art, but it's also really informative as well. And it kind of cuts to what we have kind of discussed today. And it kind of sort of transforms the experience and kind of makes you think. And I guess this will be our last point that we bring up. And Nathan, I think that you're in a pretty good position to help answer it. As data visualization continues, what's next? How does data visualization continue to evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think, again, if you look through the kind of the course of the industry, the fundamentals haven't really changed in a long time. We have pretty solid research on what people can easily understand visually, what are effective ways to create visualization. So then the challenge is really, how do we continue to allow more people into this world and more people to explore their world using visualization as a tool to convey that? People who might not ever think of themselves as somebody for whom working with data, working with analytics and visualization is their core job. Certainly might not ever write any code. And then how do we make those outputs more accessible? I think we've seen some really awesome stuff happening in the last few years in data-driven journalism, some really fantastic things being produced. How do we make that kind of understanding of the world more ubiquitous and more accessible to more people? So it's really not a fundamental change in what data visualization is, in my opinion, but more, how do we let more people in to do it? And how do we share the results with more people? And there's a lot that goes along with that, data infrastructure, and even helping the sort of average population statistical literacy go up. So people aren't doing those kind of mistakes and sort of challenges in visualization. How do we help people do the right things as well? And that requires a little bit more domain knowledge and understanding. But I would say, in a word, ubiquity and expansion of access.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think also not only with the disseminating of that information, there's also ongoing research of this psychological effect of visualizations, and specifically on anthropographical visualizations, whether or not using a visualization to embody a human element, whether it's actually a figure of a human being, whether it's an individual or an aggregate, whether it's more abstract versus more of a human shape, whether it's labeled as a human being, what effect that has on the person viewing that visualization and more relating to it. It's inconclusive as of right now as to whether or not that really heightens somebody's ingestion of the insight and also has them follow through with a call to action. But still, I think that might be sort of the next step, is sort of analyzing that realm.
Yeah, there's some really interesting work that was done around a visualization type called Chernoff faces, which are kind of funny if you've seen them. They're basically, the thinking was people are really good at reading expressions and emotions off another human's face. So what if we could translate that into a visualization?
Yes.
And it turned out that it didn't actually work that well. And it was actually in a lot of ways confusing for people. So I'd be very interested to see where that goes, if there are ways to actually sort of find success in that. But I think it sometimes it can be, those kind of sort of adding more to the visualization can be a little bit distracting. And so, yeah, if we can crack that and really make visualizations that speak to people on a deeper kind of emotional level, I think that would be fantastic. But there's certainly been, looking back on the sort of history of the field, a number of cases where that's been tried and met with, at best, maybe mixed success. So, definitely curious to see where we're going there as well.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap it up. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us today. This was a wonderful conversation. I'm going to give you the last word in a second. Just one quick plug for the Banana Data Podcast. If you like what you hear, please be sure to subscribe to the Banana Data Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. If you guys are unfamiliar with Tableau, and if you're listening to this podcast, I find that hard to believe, check out Tableau. It's an amazing resource. And Nathan, I'll give you the final word to wrap everything up.
Well, Corey, CPM, it was really great being here. I really enjoyed being able to talk data viz with you guys. Obviously, an area where there's so much going on. Certainly, this would be a very long podcast if we even tried to be complete. So, very exciting to talk about everything. And I think we're going to see lots of exciting stuff coming around, really everything that we've talked about here in the near future and further out. So great to have a chance to be a part of it.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, CPM. See you next time, everyone.
Bye, team.
Bye-bye.